Hi guys, this is Joe Goodspeed at Diamondback Fly Rods, and we are going to discuss some of the stuff that I do at Diamondback as far as designing the rods and what new things we have going on with product development. Over the past about 24 months, I have had this project for the new Generation IV Nymph rod, which is now a named project. But to start with, it was just when I finished the Ideal Nymph rods, I right away felt like the Ideal Nymph rod was a pretty quickly put together and finished project that was based on just the fact that I had already done a lot of work with nymph rods and had a pretty good idea of what my strategies were for tapers and actions to build the Ideal Nymph rods here at Diamondback. But once those were complete and they were well received by the market, I felt like there was some low-hanging fruit for me as a designer to do something that was a more in-depth, more tuned version of what those Ideal Nymph rods were. And also at the same time, I could see that the nymph market was starting to change and was moving in somewhat of a linear direction towards things being smaller and things being lighter, and more anglers having the experience that allowed them to have better control of the products, which also in turn allows them to fish smaller and lighter. Those things go hand in hand. The increased skill and the ability to fish smaller and fish lighter, fish more at distance, fish control lighter leaders. So seeing things moving in that direction, and also seeing that the fish getting more pressure from more skilled anglers and increasing skill sets from anglers are becoming more in tune to rejecting larger flies, spitting flies out really quickly, which causes, this is what happened in Europe, where the Europeans had an advantage for a long time on the USA anglers just based on their fish being really difficult and that driving their tactics to be more precise. So this is my opinion of what drove this relationship. And in the United States, we had so much easy fishing with tailwaters and really high fish concentrations that it did not force our anglers to have the necessity for as precise of tactics as even today a lot of the fisheries in France or Spain particularly have extremely clear water, difficult fish, really requiring precise nymphing tactics and precise strike detection methods to catch those fish. And so in the United States, I feel like we've been catching up to the necessity for those types of tactics, but we're getting there, and you can see from our success in the international competitions that that's something that we are, definitely become a player in with those countries that have those types of fishing to be able to have our anglers compete with their best anglers as well. And so how that relates to what I was doing at Diamondback was I wanted to create a product that really reflected the changes in the market and how things were getting smaller and lighter, and I wanted the rods to, in particular, be able to load and deliver smaller, lighter flies relative to the line weight. So with the Ideal Nymph rods, there's certain size flies that the 2-weight, 3-weight rods can handle. And my vision was to see a rod with a 2 or 3-weight power backbone hook setting ability be able to deliver, cast, load, and control these really fine micro leaders and really lighter, smaller flies that a lot of the most successful anglers are focusing their efforts on. And for me, that meant I had to do some fishing and to adjust the things that I was fishing with towards using these micro leaders and these really small flies as I was fishing for the past 2 years, developing these rod models to make sure that the rods were doing the type of behavior that would optimize using the different materials and the differences in the tapers of these rods were only going to really be able to improve on what I did from the Ideal Nymph rods if I got everything right with incorporating the similar backbone and hook setting ability that the ideal nymph rods have into a more gentle progressive taper in the top half of the rods that would allow for an easier load and to fish the lighter flies without needing as much of a weight with the anchor flies, or to fish multiple flies to be able to go down fish a single nymph in places where you might have needed 2 flies before to get enough weight to get the momentum to control where you put the cast, or to be able to cast the flies far enough to need multiple flies to get the flies there. So these new rods that I've designed have the ability to do these things that the ideal nymph rods do not. And one important factor with the lighter, smaller leaders and optimizing a rod to work with those is having a lower guide spacing where the lowest guide is pretty close to the handle, so you don't have much sag of line to control with the lightweight leader material that you can use when you're fishing the when you're using a micro leader or using really tiny flies. The size of the leaders people are using are getting smaller and smaller. I know I'm not quite willing to go as small as some of the competitive anglers or just, very successful micro leader anglers are going. But I did spend a lot of time fishing these rods with small enough leaders that I was able to understand the behavior of the rods as far as the hook setting and loading and delivering the flies, of how these rods needed to be different and are different than the ideal nymph rods. When I'm doing design work, one of the things that's really unique about the Diamondback rods and the way that I work in design is that typically there's a communication gap between the pros on the water who are fishing with the rods and who have the potential vision of what the action of the rod optimally should be, and then the engineer who is doing the adjustments to, the choosing the mandrels, choosing the materials, choosing the wall thickness and the pattern shape that the materials are cut into when they're rolled around the mandrel. All of those things that an engineer is going to be doing are oftentimes, the person who's doing that is very rarely going to be the person who is out on the stream who knows, in order to set the hook with this size 18 hook, we're going to need to have a little bit more stiffness or rigidity in the bottom end of the rod. And so that might be something that a guide, can come back to the engineer and say, when I'm setting the hook with smaller flies, the fish are bouncing off, or the rod is having some sort of a reverb that's not optimal, and something needs to be stiffer in the bottom end of the rod. And so even if a pro tells an engineer that engineer needs to try to put themselves into the shoes of the pro who's doing the fishing and understand what they communicate with words and how those words relate to the action and the feeling and the ability to make an adjustment to a section of rod to change in any number of ways. You could have the mandrel expansion rate be greater or smaller. You could have the material that's wrapped around that mandrel be stiffer or softer, or have a different resin system that has certain properties, or have a different reinforcement fiber that holds the unidirectional fibers together that has different properties, or use a different fabric area weight of fabric, which is like how thick the cloth is, that determines how big of a pattern you need and how many revolutions around the mandrel you're going to get to achieve your wall thickness. All of those factors are really dynamic things that you could do in different ways that it's hard to, for me as a designer, and also as the angler who's on the water, who's doing the fishing, who is trying to decide what needs to happen with the rod. What I feel on the water is such a dynamic thing of knowing the way the rod bends and the way, if something isn't happening the way it needs to be, what is missing and needs to be added as opposed to, what's happening that's excessive and needs to be subtracted. They're both difficult things, especially the closer a rod gets to being a final product, the harder it is to make those accurate fine adjustments, and the harder it would be for a pro to communicate what those accurate fine adjustments would be once a rod is getting pretty close. Because for me, with the Generation 4 rods, the entire last year of development, I was only fishing them myself and making the adjustments. And although there's a few pros out there who handled these rods, I don't make adjustments that the pros tell me. I look for feedback from those pros and I weigh that against what I feel on the water, and then the adjustments that I make are very much based on a feeling and kind of a vision for what the feeling should be if the feeling doesn't seem to be right, or if there's something about the action. Especially, with the rods, it's easy to feel what goes and casts a nymph around well. Being able to set the hook with different size hooks and be able to tell when you're getting a reverb on the rod and when you are potentially getting an action that might bounce a fish versus developing an action that delivers a nice firm application of power without reverberation when you go to set the hook. That's something that's, for me, that's the trickiest thing about a nymph rod, and understanding how to manipulate the expansion of the taper and the wall thickness and the stiffness of the parts of the rod to get that right. And for a lot of rods on the market, the shortcoming of them is they have a reverb, or they bounce fish, or they don't deliver a firm, smooth application of power when people go to set the hook, that causes them to just not fish quite as effectively. And it's hard to describe what's wrong with the action when that's not happening, but it's easy to see what's wrong when you're setting the hook and the fish aren't staying hooked. So those are some of the things that's different about the Diamondback rods, where I am able to make those adjustments based on the feel. And when it comes to the feeling of things, what you feel is the way, when a rod bends, you feel the way it recovers. And in the industry, we are oftentimes seeing these pictures of deflection boards where you'll have a grid and you'll have a rod that has a piece of weight hanging off of it in a static, unmoving way that shows you the flex profile of the rod. And really, there's no fish that you catch where the rod stays in one set position as you go about, casting your line, hooking the fish, and pulling it back in. It's always a dynamic situation where the rod is bending and rebounding, and that recovery speed and action and feeling all contributes to how the rod is effectively working for you. And so for me, I stopped using deflection boards when I started designing at Diamondback. My previous job, I still did some deflection board work where I compared rods using the deflection boards, but since I've worked at Diamondback, I have designed entirely by feel and and then making adjustments to those few factors that I mentioned before, like the expansion rate and the materials, the fabric area weight of the material, and the pattern shape, how much material is put onto the mandrel. All of those variables are things that I understand well enough to be able to work with them, to feel a rod and to fish with the rod, and to be able to take right here a clipboard and a mechanical pencil and to make the notes about what I feel in what sections of the rod I'm feeling it in order to make a adjustment to the blank. And I will say that when I make adjustments to blanks, I don't always make the right adjustments. And sometimes I overshoot what I'm looking to do, and this happened with the Generation 4 Nymph rods. A couple of the models towards the end, I actually overshot in a direction where I was making an adjustment and went to a previous iteration of the blank to take a step back to make sure I got back to where I thought the rods were fishing better, because I had done something with the wall thickness that was affecting the way the rods were retaining fish on the hook sets. And I had to be honest with myself that adjustments I made were not the right ones, and to take a step back. But that's the sort of thing that if you have a slow enough design process like the 2 years that I took with the Generation 4 rods, you can make those, really fine adjustments that are proven on the water to be the right ones before having the rod go to market. And so with the Generation 4 rods, I'm very confident, based on my own experience on the water, fishing them and adjusting them until the point that I thought that they had the right actions for me to feel that they were optimal for the rod weights and lengths that I was targeting, that now that the rods are going to come out to market, it's been a long time and people are waiting for them, but I'm extremely confident in what the action and quality, durability, every aspect of what the final product is going to be on the Generation 4 rods, just based on really doing thorough background work myself on the water in the field to make sure that the rods were just what I wanted them to be. So those Generation 4 Nymph rods that I have been working on are going to be shipping out to our dealers first. The dealers who are pre-ordering them are going to get them around mid-February, and they're basically going to be sold out for the initial stock, all going to our dealers. So we're not going to be offering them at that initial date through the Diamondback website sales channel, but all our major dealers. And you can find our dealers through our website. Dealer Locator that'll show where our main dealers are. So these rods are going to be coming out there in mid-February, and there are 8 models of Generation 4 rods. The models are a 10-foot 1 weight, 10-foot 2 weight, 10-foot 3 weight, and a 10-foot 7-inch 1 weight, 2 weight, 3 weight, 6 weight, and 7 weight. So there's 3 rods in 10 feet, 3 rods in trout sizes in 10-foot 7, and then a 10-foot 7.6 and a 10-foot 7.7. And the new model in 7 will be large enough to fish for king salmon, up to about 30 pounds. The new 10-foot 7 6 weight is a rod that will handle fish a lot bigger than the Ideal Nymph 10-10-6. The 10-7-6 is going to be better for fish up to about 18-20 pounds, where the Ideal Nymph 10-10-6 was good for fish up to about 13-14 pounds, and then it has trouble steering the fish. And those the 1, 2, and 3 weight of the Generation 4 rods are lighter weight and action rods than the Ideal Nymph rods in those same line weights. So the Ideal Nymph rods, they've got a lot of backbone. They're a little bit harder to load with micro leaders and smaller flies, especially, the 2 and 3 weight rods. They're a pretty big 2 and 3. The new Generation 4 rods in 2 and 3 compared to the Ideal Nymph rods in 2 and 3 are going to have a considerably lighter action in the tip and as far as loading with the smaller flies. They will still have a similar amount of backbone. All of the new rods still in the bottom end have good backbone that's necessary for, getting the hook sets and hook retention that you need with any nymph rod. But these are going to be lighter, softer. They're going to be easier to load, less reverb when you go to check the rod up to, make a nymphing presentation with them. If you like to fish dry dropper or to cast lines overhead, you are going to want to use a 1 line weight heavier rod in these Generation 4 rods than you would have wanted in Ideal Nymph. So in Ideal Nymph, the 10-foot 2 weight is the most popular rod model. That's a popular overhead casting rod. The Generation 4 10-foot 3 weight is the most similar action to the Ideal Nymph 10-foot 2 weight, and I think it's an improved rod over that Ideal Nymph 10-foot 2 weight. But if you liked that rod, I don't suggest getting the new 10-foot 2. I suggest getting the new 10-foot 3 as the apples to apples model to replace your Ideal Nymph 10-foot 2 weight if you want to upgrade that popular rod. So I got to catch some nice chrome steelhead on the new 10-foot 7 6 weight a couple weeks ago, and the 10-7-6 is a superb rod. It's one of the top blanks that I have ever designed, and I've designed about 150 rods that have gone to market now between my previous job and at Diamondback. And I was thinking to myself while I was landing big steelhead with that rod that this was about my finest work. So I really like the new 10.7.6. I like that new 10.7.3 because I like to fish bigger nymphs oftentimes with like size 6, 8, 10 hooks and things like crayfish flies for big marginal water trout. And that new 10.7.3 is a great balance of being very comfortable to deliver the flies with, but having a great amount of power to hook and retain fish on the bigger hooks with the bigger fish, the bigger river trout. So, you know, for me, that the 10.7.3, the 10.7.2, and the 10.7.1 are all really awesome rods. I like the 10.7 length myself. I think that for people who have done very well with the 10-foot length rods and the longer rods have been a little bit cumbersome for them, this 10.7 length, it feels like a 10-foot rod. It's very easy to control, to be precise with it, and there's not much swing weight. So for me, the new 10.7 rods feel about a similar swing weight to the 10-foot Ideal Nymph rods, and they're far more comfortable than the 10-foot 10 Ideal Nymph rods. So I'm excited about this whole lineup. I put a lot of time into the entire thing, and I don't think that there's a bad, blank in that lineup. With the nymph rods, oftentimes every single good nymph rod is going to be a rod that's going to have a lot of different applications that you can use in different situations, but at the same time there's probably going to be one certain model for any given time and place that's going to be the one that you'd want to reach for and use. So if you consistently fish the same types of waters or the same stream potentially, as some people, have a local good river that they're always fishing, and that's cool. That's something where if you reach out to us, I'm happy to answer questions about what type of fishing you do, what size the fish are, what size hooks you use, because a lot of times you're trying to match up the rod power with how big the hooks you use are, because all of the rods fight fish really well. You've got a 10 to 10 foot 7 inch rod, you've got good backbone, you've got lots of leverage. But if you like to use larger flies like a jig streamer and you put that on the one weight rod, what you'll have is you'll have a hard time setting the hook effectively, and you'll have the fish bounce off because the one weight rod doesn't have the tip and tip mid power to get penetration with a size 10 hook very well with a jig streamer. That same jig streamer on the 10 foot 7 3 weight, boom, powerful sharp hook sets. You can smash that hook into a bony mouth like hook jawed brown. That rod's the right choice for that. So oftentimes when someone tells me that they're really into using a jig streamer or they only fish really tiny Perdigon type flies, I can say, well, for what you're doing, that one weight rod is going to give you the best, casting precision, and you're going to have all of the hook setting power and fighting power you need with those small hooks and the light leaders to use that one weight on those 20-inch class trout on your fishery. So when people are trying to match up a rod that's the best fit for them for what they're doing, for me, I often ask a question about what size hooks they want to be using as one of the determining factors to give them that advice. I answer the company phone and I answer all of the technical questions. So with my background as formerly I designed fly lines, I was the product manager for Cortland Line Company and just have a very strong understanding of just the line shapes, head weights, densities of the sinking lines from designing fly lines and overseeing the manufacturing facility of fly lines for a couple of years at Cortland Line Company. And that gives me a really good understanding of matching up both lines with rods that I design, and also from working with rods and lines, I have a lot of experience being able to talk people through understanding kind of what their issues are when they are troubleshooting something where they're having trouble with a rod not matching with the line or a line not casting well on the rod. It kind of goes, but it can go in both directions with the customer service questions. But it's a strength of mine to be able to help troubleshoot casting and line matching and choosing a rod for different types of fishing things. And so as the person who communicates with the customers at Diamondback, oftentimes I'm able to talk to someone about what their question is and have some direct personal, advice for them based on things that I've done or things that I've done in the industry to help them make a good choice with the rod or the line, or even sometimes rigging up with the leaders and other parts of aspects of fishing with the equipment. Sometimes people ask me about my flies and things like that. It all goes hand in hand with doing customer service when you're working in the fly industry. The warranty policy for Diamondback Fly Rods is, for one thing, the rods do not need to be registered. We oftentimes get questions, do they still need to be registered? Previously they did, most companies do. But the problem that I've faced working in the industry with registering the rods is that oftentimes within your family, passing a rod down to, someone's child, or the rods will move around in a way that's oftentimes not a nefarious thing. And even if someone decides to sell their rods, from Diamondback's perspective, we don't consider that to be a nefarious thing. And so for Diamondback, we have the same warranty for rods without having them be registered. So whether you buy the rod yourself, you end up, selling it to your friend for some reason, you give it to your kid, there's no questions asked. We have the same warranty policy for anyone who has that rod. The policy is, if you have a break, we have standardized fittings, so the sections of the rod, we know how big they are. We can give you a part that will fit that section of the rod without needing to have you ship the rod back to us. What we ask for is, on our website, there's a repairs form. We ask for a photo of the broken section of the rod to help us verify that you do have a broken rod, and to see what section of the rod it is that's broken, so we can make sure as we replace the section that we're getting the right section for your rod. And then it's a $50 per section and $15 shipping fee on repairs. So if you break your rod tip, the total cost should be $65. If you're in the continental or any part of the United States shipping block, that is that $15 shipping fee applies. And for international, it's the same price for the part, and it's just applicable local shipping charges. So depending on where you are, if you're in a really remote place, we just ask you to cover the shipping of getting the part to where you are for that part of the warranty service. And so we keep the parts in stock, and for the vast majority of our repair situations, when someone has a repair, in just a couple days, we're able to turn around the part and ship it out and get you back out on the water. Since I've been at Diamondback, there's been a series of things that I have designed, and all of those rods we intend to do this repair service on for years to come. We're stocking all of the repair parts for them, for the Ideal Nymph rods, even though we're going to kind of discontinue some of those models as the Generation 4 rods come out. We intend to be doing repairs and stocking repair parts for all of those popular Ideal Nymph rods for years. So that shouldn't be a big concern. For some of the older rods, and Diamondback is a 40-year-old company, so we aren't able to do repairs on some of the real early stuff. It's just, the materials, the manuals, it's unrealistic now. And so we offer a 60% discount on a current product when someone has something that is of the era that we no longer can do repairs on them. There is still something that we try to offer and try to get people into something that we can still, do repairs on for years, and one of the more current products. So that's our policy with the older stuff. Finally, getting to the end of these Generation 4 blanks, and right now I'm working on some two-hand casting stuff. I've been getting into Atlantic salmon fishing, and I've always been into steelhead fishing, and the stuff that the anadromous fish that run out of the ocean I think are very compelling. And I respect the people who, especially the ocean fish, like the Pacific Northwest fishermen, I really respect the people who chase after these fish that are coming out of the ocean. And it's just very hard to get in front of them, and to get them to eat something can also be very hard. So right now I'm working on some shorter spey rods in 6, 7, and 8 weight is the things that right now I am working on. Like last night, I was working out tapers on a six weight 2-hand rod. So that's a project right now that is in the mix. In the next few days, I'll finish up those design concepts for the blanks, and then we can start to, you know, cut the patterns and roll the initial blanks for that that project. And when I'm doing that, you know, right now I'm doing those shorter spay rods. I'm looking at some of the recent things I designed, like the 10-foot 7-inch 7-weight Generation IV Nymph rod, and also the 9-foot 4-inch 400 grain Universal Predator rod. Those were two rods that I was looking at in terms of the expansion rate and the wall thickness of something that's an existing model that I've already brought to market recently, that I have a recent kind of structural familiarity with the certain materials that I want to be using for this 2-hand rod. That those are all things that are kind of floating around in my atmosphere as I'm looking at starting a new taper concept for something like a 2-hand rod that is, it's only, you know, going up to these rods I'm doing rods in an 11-foot 9. And so these latest Nymph rods were up at a 10-foot 7. So that's another 14 inches longer for those blanks. And I'm doing these in a different number of pieces. So that also brings another variable into the equation when you're looking at the expansion rate of the mandrels and how you're going to fit together the ferrules and build together in action. So that's a good challenge for me now. I like to do things in weird lengths because it kind of challenges me to work on platforms that I have no existing experience with. It's always harder to, the easiest thing to do is go and design like a 9-foot 5 weight or do something in a platform that a lot of people have designed on. When you go to do something in an odd length, like, you know, I've done Nymph rods in 10-foot 8, 10-foot 9, 10-foot 10, and now 10-foot 7. And I intentionally have chosen different lengths for these longer rods to make it harder for my competitors to copy my work and keep up to the speed of the new you know, tapers and the way that I'm developing the tapers for the Nymph rods. Because if they were all in 10-foot 6 inches, it would be a lot easier for several companies to just kind of replicate my work. And by doing it in these oddball lengths, it really just adds another, you know, layer of complexity to be able to cherry pick that design work and see other companies use the same stuff. So there's a reason for doing the oddball length sometimes that I choose. Well, thanks for taking the time today to hear some of my perspectives about the design things I do here at Diamondback, and I hope that everybody's able to take a look at the new Generation IV Nymph rods that we have coming out in a few months here in mid-February.